The shovel bit into the earth with a dry rasp, a sound Elias had come to know better than his own name. It was a sound of beginning. He drove the steel head down again, using the worn arch of his boot for leverage, feeling the familiar protest of root and rock. The sun beat down on the back of his neck, a constant, heavy hand pressing him toward the ground he sought to conquer. Beside him, under the meager shade of a lone, stubborn juniper, Boro lay with his head on his paws, his amber eyes tracking every movement. A low huff of breath, a puff of dust from the dog's nose, was the only commentary. It was enough. Elias worked with a rhythm born of solitude. Pry, lift, turn, toss. The pile of dark, loamy soil grew beside the deepening rectangle cut into the hillside. This was the third week. The surface grass was a distant memory. The topsoil had given way to a denser layer of clay and stone that fought back with sullen obstinacy. His hands, already calloused from a life of mending fence and splitting wood, were now landscapes of their own, mapped with new blisters that had broken, hardened, and then broken again. He did not think of the pain. It was simply a part of the process, a tax levied by the earth for the space he intended to claim. At dusk, he would straighten his back, the vertebrae cracking in a ragged chorus, and survey the day's progress. It never looked like much. A few more inches of depth, a few more feet of length. To an observer, it was just a hole, an ugly scar on the golden sweep of the hill. He would rinse his hands and face from a water barrel, the cool liquid a brief and blessed reprieve, and then sit beside Boro to eat his meal of bread and dried meat. As the sky bled from orange to purple, he would open the book. It was not a book for reading, not in the traditional sense. It was his father's journal, one of 3. The leather was cracked and smoothed by years of handling. The pages filled with a dense, spidery script and intricate diagrams drawn in ink that had faded to the color of rust. His father had been a man of quiet obsessions: geology, the movement of water, the behavior of air under pressure. The town had called him eccentric, a dreamer who had spent more time mapping bedrock than tending his own failing crops. Now, his father was gone, and all that remained were these books and the stubborn piece of land he had refused to sell. Elias traced a drawing with a dirt-caked finger. It showed a cross-section of the very hill he was digging into. Lines and arrows indicated airflow. Thermal siphon, his father had written. Cool air drawn from the north face, through a rock-filled baffle. Smoke is heavy. It will settle. Clean air is light. It will rise. Below it, calculations for load-bearing timbers, for the necessary thickness of a packed earth roof. It was not madness. It was physics. It was a plan. He worked for another month before the first visitor arrived. Mr. Abernathy sat high on his chestnut mare, his face a leathery mask of disapproval under the brim of his hat. He reined the horse to a stop at the edge of the excavation, the growing mound of earth a testament to Elias's singular, silent focus. "Thorn," Abernathy said. His voice was gravelly, accustomed to shouting over the wind at stubborn cattle. "What in God's name are you doing?" Elias looked up, shielding his eyes from the sun. He didn't stop his work, just paused with the shovel halfway to the pile. "Digging," Abernathy scoffed, a dry, rattling sound. "I can see that. Looks like you're trying to dig your own grave. Is this about your father? Grieving's one thing, son, but this—" He gestured with a gloved hand at the hole. "This is madness." The word hung in the air, heavy and sharp. It was the same word they had used for his father. Elias drove the shovel into the earth again. "Building a root cellar." "A root cellar the size of a church?" Abernathy shook his head, the leather of his saddle creaking.
"You're digging too deep. The summer ground's hard as iron, but wait until the winter rains. This whole hill will slump. It'll bury you in whatever foolishness you're building. Your father filled his head with books and theories, but he never understood this land. Not the way a man who works it does."
Elias said nothing. He lifted the shovelful of earth and tossed it onto the pile. The action was his only reply. He had heard it all before, the dismissal of his father's knowledge, the elevation of tradition over inquiry. He would not argue. The earth would argue for him in time. Abernathy watched him for another long minute, his expression a mixture of pity and frustration. Burro, who had lifted his head at the man's approach, let out a low rumble in his chest, a vibration Elias could feel through the soles of his boots.
"Suit yourself,"
Abernathy finally grunted, turning his horse.
"Don't say I didn't warn you when you're eating mud."
He rode away, a silhouette of certainty against the vast, indifferent sky. Elias watched him go, then looked down at the open journal resting on a flat rock. He saw the diagrams of retaining walls, the notes on soil composition and water tables. His father had understood the land. He had understood it layer by layer, from the ancient stone at its heart to the delicate grasses on its skin. Mr. Abernathy saw a hill. His father had seen a machine, a living system of pressures and forces that could be understood, respected, and even harnessed. He picked up his shovel. There was so much more work to do. The seasons turned on the slow wheel of Elias's labor. The heat of summer baked the clay into brick, forcing him to use a pickaxe, the jarring shock of each blow traveling up his arms and into his shoulders until his whole body hummed with exhaustion. Burro would retreat further under the juniper, panting in the shade, his loyalty a silent, steady presence. The autumn rains came, just as Abernathy had predicted, but the hill did not slump. Elias had followed his father's designs, digging trenches to divert the water, shoring the walls with heavy timbers he'd felled and stripped himself. The hole became a muddy pit, and the work became a grim battle against slurry and damp. But he did not stop. Sheriff Brody's patrol truck kicked up a cloud of dust when it pulled up one crisp October afternoon. The sheriff was a thick-set man whose authority rested on a foundation of weary pragmatism. He leaned against the truck's fender, arms crossed over his chest. "Elias," he said, his voice even. "I've had some folks in town express concern." Elias was setting a corner post, his clothes and face smeared with mud. He paused, holding the heavy timber in place with one hand. "I'm fine, Sheriff." "Are you?" Brody's eyes swept over the massive excavation, the neat stacks of lumber, the growing piles of quarried stone. "Mrs. Gable thinks you're starving out here. Abernathy thinks you're digging a hole to China. Frankly, I'm just wondering what the hell this is." "It's a foundation," Elias said. It wasn't a lie, merely an incomplete truth. "A foundation for what? There's no permit filed for a new structure on this parcel. You know the rules." "It's a cellar," Elias repeated, his voice flat. "Underground. Doesn't need a permit." Brody sighed, running a hand over his face. "Son, people are worried. After your father, well, being alone out here, doing this, it's not what folks consider normal." "Normal didn't work for my father," Elias said, his voice quiet but firm. He hefted the timber, setting it perfectly into the notch he had carved. "This will." The sheriff stayed for a while, asking questions that Elias answered with single words or short, unadorned sentences. He saw the careful joinery, the precise angles, the sheer scale of the undertaking. He saw not madness, but an unnerving degree of methodical purpose. He left with more questions than answers, shaking his head as he drove away. The first snows of winter found Elias working on the roof structure, a heavy grid of interlocking beams. He worked in the biting cold, his breath pluming in the air, his fingers stiff and clumsy inside worn leather gloves. The work was slower, harder. The ground was frozen solid, but the main excavation was done. Now it was the work of building, of giving the whole a shape and a purpose beyond its own emptiness. It was during one of these cold spells that Lena started her deliveries. She ran the town's general store, having taken it over from her parents. The first time, she brought a sack of flour, smoked bacon, and a dozen jars of preserved peaches he hadn't ordered. "My mistake," she said, her smile small and genuine, not a hint of pity in her eyes. "Figured you could use it before it goes bad." She didn't ask what he was building, not at first. She just looked at the site, her gaze taking in the details others missed. The way the support beams were notched to bear weight, the neat channels he had dug for drainage, the organized chaos of his tools. Boro, who was wary of most strangers, walked right up to her and rested his head against her hand. "He's a good dog," she said, scratching behind Boro's ears. "The best," Elias agreed. It was the longest sentence he'd offered a visitor in months. She came every 2 weeks after that, bringing supplies and news from town. She talked, and he listened, nodding or offering a quiet comment. She never used the word madness. She used words like strong and precise. One day, she pointed to the half-finished entrance tunnel, its walls lined with carefully fitted stones. "It's beautiful," she said. "The stonework. It looks like an old Roman arch." Elias stopped what he was doing. He looked at the arch and then at her. No one had ever called his work beautiful. Functional, perhaps. Strange, certainly. But not beautiful. "My father's design," he said, feeling an unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. He gestured toward the small cabin where he lived. "I have his journals." Her eyes lit up with genuine curiosity. "Could I see them sometime?" "Yes," he said. "You could." That winter, as he toiled in the frozen silence, a fragile connection began to form. A thread of warmth and understanding spun in the cold air between the isolated hill and the small town in the valley below. Lena did not judge his silence or his strange, colossal project. She saw the hands that built it, the mind that guided them, and the legacy that fueled them both. She saw him. And for the first time since his father's death, Elias felt something other than the weight of the earth and the solitary drive of his purpose. He felt seen. Spring arrived with a torrent of meltwater, turning the world to mud. The shelter, now roofed with a thick layer of sod and earth, remained dry inside. The drainage channels worked perfectly. Elias spent the spring and early summer working on the interior, and the most crucial, most misunderstood part of his father's design, the ventilation system. He dug 2 long, deep trenches extending from the rear of the main chamber, uphill toward the cool, shaded north face of the ridge. He laid wide-diameter ceramic pipes in the trenches, then filled them completely with tons of fist-sized rocks he hauled 1 barrow load at a time. At the surface, he built low, wide cairns of stone over the intakes, designed to look like natural features of the landscape. Mr. Abernathy rode by again one sweltering day in July. He saw the rock piles and reined in his horse, his face a study in utter bewilderment. "Pipes? Now you're burying pipes?" he called out. "What for? You planning on plumbing, Thorne? Running water to your tomb?" "Air," Elias said simply, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a dusty forearm. "Air? Abernathy laughed, a harsh, humorless bark. "There's air everywhere, son. You don't need to bury pipes to find it." "I need cool air," Elias said. "Clean air." He didn't elaborate. He knew it was pointless. To Abernathy and to everyone else, it was just another piece of the madness, more wasted effort on a fool's errand. The summer grew hotter and drier than any in living memory. The creeks dwindled to trickles, and the grass on the hills cured to a brittle golden tinder. A permanent haze settled in the valley, smelling of dust and distant smoke. The old-timers like Abernathy watched the sky with narrowed, anxious eyes. They talked of the fire of '38, the one that had jumped the river and nearly wiped the town off the map. Animals grew restless. Deer moved down from the high country earlier than usual, their coats ragged, their eyes wild. Boro became Elias's shadow, rarely leaving his side, often whining softly in his sleep. A deep primal unease settled over the land. Elias worked with a new urgency. He spent weeks building the door. It was a massive thing. 3 layers of thick green timber, wood still heavy with sap that would resist burning, bolted together and sheathed in metal. It was fitted into a heavy stone frame, designed to seal with an airtight precision that had taken him a month of careful chiseling to achieve. He stockpiled the shelter with sacks of flour, beans, and rice. He filled barrels with clean water from the deep well he had dug in the main chamber's floor. He laid in stacks of blankets, lanterns, oil, and medical supplies. Lena, watching him haul the last of the sacks underground, finally asked the question that had been hovering between them for months. Her voice was quiet, devoid of the mockery he heard from others. "Elias, what are you preparing for?" He stopped, turning to face her. The sun was a pale, hazy disk in the smoky sky. He looked past her, toward the brittle hills, the anxious world. "A long winter," he said. It was the only answer he could give. She looked at the enormous door, the deep, cool darkness of the tunnel beyond it, and the tireless, determined man standing before her. She nodded slowly. "I'll bring more candles on my next delivery," she said, "and bandages, just in case." The fire started on a Tuesday in late August, sparked by a lightning strike in the dry, inaccessible timber of the backcountry. For 2 days it was a distant threat, a plume of smoke on the horizon that the town watched with a growing sense of dread. Then the wind shifted. A hot, dry gale blew in from the east, and the fire exploded. It became a living thing, a roaring, ravenous beast that devoured miles of forest in an hour, leaping ridges and canyons with terrifying ease. The sky turned a bruised, apocalyptic orange. Ash, fine as silt, began to fall, coating everything in a layer of gray snow. The air grew thick and hot, smelling of pine resin and doom. The town's volunteer fire siren began to wail, a long, mournful cry that was soon lost in the rising roar of the wind and the approaching flames. Sheriff Brody's truck sped through town, his voice distorted by a loudspeaker, ordering a mandatory evacuation. "Head south. The highway is the only way out. Go now." But the fire was faster than they were. By midday it had jumped the river, a feat no one had thought possible. It raced up the valley, a wall of flame hundreds of feet high, cutting off the highway south. The town was trapped. Panic erupted. Trucks and cars clogged the single main street, people running, shouting, their faces stark with terror. Elias stood at the entrance to his shelter. He had thrown the heavy door wide open. The stone-lined tunnel gaped like a welcoming mouth, cool air breathing from its depths. Boro stood beside him, silent and steady. Elias didn't shout. He didn't wave his arms or plead. He just stood there, a fixed point in a world dissolving into chaos. Lena was one of the first to arrive. She pulled up in her rattling pickup truck, its bed filled with Mrs. Gable and her 3 terrified grandchildren. Her face was smudged with soot, but her eyes were clear and full of trust. "Elias," she cried, her voice tight with strain. "It's cut off. The highway's gone." "Bring them inside," he said calmly. He helped lift the crying children from the truck bed, guiding them and their grandmother toward the tunnel. "There's room. There's water." Soon others came, a trickle at first, then a flood. They came on foot, in trucks, on tractors, their faces streaked with ash and tears, their eyes reflecting the terrifying orange glow that was now consuming the ridge above the town. They were the ones who hadn't gotten out in time, the ones who had hesitated, the ones who had nowhere else to go. Sheriff Brody arrived, his uniform torn, his face grim. He was herding a group of 20 people ahead of him. He saw Elias and the open shelter, and for a moment he just stared, comprehension dawning on his smoke-reddened eyes. "Get in," Elias said, his voice cutting through the noise. "All of you, quickly!" The last to arrive was Mr. Abernathy, his face blackened, his clothes singed. He stumbled up the path, leading his prized mare, his breath coming in ragged sobs. He had lost everything. His ranch, his cattle, a lifetime of work, all of it erased in a matter of minutes. He looked at Elias, at the hole in the ground he had mocked for 2 years, and his proud, stubborn certainty finally broke. "Thorn," he choked out, his voice cracking. "There's no time," Elias said, his tone not unkind. He took the reins of the frightened horse and led it into the wide tunnel, settling it in a side alcove he had designed for just such a purpose. "Get your people inside." Abernathy turned and bellowed at his family, who were huddled by his truck. They streamed toward the shelter, their faces etched with a desperate, dawning hope. 90 people. 90 souls, from infants to the elderly, filed past Elias into the cool, quiet dark of the earth. When the last person was inside, he and Sheriff Brody put their shoulders to the massive door. With a deep groan of timber and a final solid thud, it sealed, plunging them into the soft, steady glow of the lanterns Lena was already lighting. Outside, the world became a muffled, hellish roar. The air inside was cool and still, tasting of damp earth and stone. It was a stark, almost shocking contrast to the searing, smoke-choked inferno they had just escaped. The roar of the firestorm outside was a deep, continuous rumble, a bass note of planetary rage that vibrated through the soles of their feet. But it was distant, muted by the tons of earth and rock that formed their shield. Dozens of lanterns cast a warm, flickering light through the main chamber, revealing the faces of the survivors. They were huddled in small groups, children clutching their parents, neighbors comforting neighbors, their expressions a mixture of shock, terror, and dawning disbelief. 90 people, 2 dogs, and a horse shared the same subterranean space, breathing the same clean air. Elias moved through the crowd with a quiet purpose that seemed to anchor the swirling currents of fear. He checked the main ventilation shaft, his hand held over the grate. A steady, cool draft flowed into the chamber. He nodded to himself. The thermal siphon was working. His father's theory, drawn in faded ink on a brittle page, was now a life-saving reality. Lena was already organizing things, her natural pragmatism a balm in the chaos. She directed mothers with young children to a quieter corner where Elias had stored blankets. She worked with Mrs. Gable, who had found her composure and was now tending to a man with a nasty burn on his arm, using supplies from the medical chest Elias had pointed out. Sheriff Brody, his official authority rendered moot by the apocalypse outside, found a new purpose. He stood beside Elias, staring at the intricate timbering of the ceiling. "I'll be damned, Thorn," he said, his voice low and heavy with awe. "You actually did it."
"My father did," Elias replied, his gaze distant for a moment. "I just built it." Mr. Abernathy, his face a mask of weary ruin, approached them. He walked over to the opposite wall, where the second ventilation pipe entered the chamber. He knelt, his calloused farmer's hand feeling the impossible coolness of the air flowing from the grate. He looked at the pipe, then at the solid earth walls, then back at Elias. "The pipes," he said, his voice raspy. "For air." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of profound, world-altering revelation. He had mocked them, called them foolishness. Now he was breathing the clean, cool air they provided while his world burned to ash above. "Yes," Elias said. Abernathy slowly got to his feet. He looked Elias in the eye, and the younger man saw not arrogance or pity, but a deep, humbling shame. "I'm sorry, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I called it madness. I called you a fool. This is wisdom." He looked around at the faces of his family, his neighbors, all of them safe. "This is a miracle." For 2 days and 2 nights they lived underground. The world was reduced to the steady glow of lanterns, the murmur of conversation, the cry of a baby, and the constant, deep hum of the firestorm overhead. Elias and Lena managed the water, rationing it carefully from the deep, stone-lined well. They distributed the food he had stockpiled, hardtack biscuits and dried fruit, a meager but life-sustaining meal. There was no panic. A strange sense of community formed in the belly of the earth, a bond forged in shared catastrophe and shared salvation. The titles and hierarchies of the town above, rancher, sheriff, storekeeper, melted away. They were simply survivors, all indebted to the quiet, stubborn young man they had once dismissed. On the 3rd morning, the deep rumbling from above began to subside. Elias pressed his ear to the heavy door, listening intently. The roar had faded to an intermittent whisper, the sound of the wind moving through a dead and silent landscape. "It's past," he announced. The chamber fell silent. With the help of Abernathy and Sheriff Brody, he heaved the great door open. A sliver of gray light cut through the darkness, and the air that entered was acrid with the smell of cold smoke and wet ash. It had rained. Elias was the first one out. He stepped into a world transformed, a monochromatic landscape of black and gray. The hill was bald and blackened. The juniper tree that had shaded Boro was a skeletal charcoal stick. The town in the valley below was gone. Here and there, a stone chimney stood like a tombstone, but everything else, the houses, the stores, the church, had been reduced to ash and smoldering embers. The world was silent, save for the soughing of the wind. The others emerged behind him, blinking in the flat gray light. A collective gasp went through the crowd, followed by sobs of grief for all that was lost. But they were alive. They stood on the scorched earth, 90 souls who should have perished, breathing the smoky air under a sky the color of slate. They gathered around the entrance to the shelter, this impossible structure of earth and stone, and looked at Elias Thorne, not as the town eccentric, but as their savior. Mrs. Gable came to him, her face streaked with tears and soot, and simply hugged him. Abernathy clapped a heavy hand on his shoulder. "Anything you need to rebuild, son," he said, his voice thick. "Anything at all. You just ask." In the weeks that followed, the shelter became the heart of a new community. It was the only intact structure for 50 miles. The survivors lived in its cool, spacious chambers while they began the slow, arduous process of rebuilding their lives from the ashes. Elias, once the town outcast, was now its center. They came to him not just for food and water, but for guidance.
His quiet competence became the bedrock on which they started to build anew. He did not hoard his knowledge. He brought out his father's journals, the pages now seeming sacred, and spread them on a makeshift table. He showed Abernathy the principles of the thermal siphon. He explained to Sheriff Brody the importance of building with stone and earth, of respecting the power of fire. The journals, once the source of mockery, became the blueprints for a new, more resilient town. People who had once scoffed at the dreamer and his mad son now studied the faded diagrams with the reverence of scholars examining a holy text. They learned to dig deep. Years passed. The town of Renewal, as it came to be called, rose from the valley floor. The new houses were built partially underground, with stone walls and earth-covered roofs, their designs all variations on the principles laid out in the Thorn journals. Fire was no longer a terror to be fled, but a force to be understood and planned for. Other communities, hearing the story, sent people to learn. Elias's madness became the region's new wisdom. Elias and Lena married in the second spring after the fire, standing on the greening hillside by the entrance to the shelter, which the townsfolk now called the Refuge. Their life was quiet and full, woven into the fabric of the community they had helped save and rebuild. Elias never sought leadership, but it found him nonetheless. He was the one people came to with difficult problems, knowing he would offer not quick words, but a slow, considered solution, rooted in a deep understanding of the world. One crisp autumn evening, more than a decade after the fire, Boro lay by the hearth in their small, sturdy house. He was old now, his muzzle gray, his movements slow and deliberate. He had been Elias's constant shadow, his silent witness through all the years of labor and ridicule, of fire and rebirth. That evening, he rested his great head on Elias's lap, gave a soft sigh, and his loyal heart grew still. Elias buried him on the hillside, under a new juniper tree that had grown near the spot where the old one had stood, marking the grave with a simple, smooth river stone. He mourned his friend with a quiet, profound grief, a sorrow for the passing of a life that had been a silent testament to unwavering faith. Decades rolled by like the seasons. The children who had been carried into the refuge grew up and had children of their own, and they all knew the story of the Inferno and the quiet man who had dug a hole to save the world. Elias and Lena grew old together, their hair turning the color of ash, their faces maps of a life well lived. He continued to teach, to share his father's knowledge, ensuring it would not be lost again. His hands, though gnarled with age, could still read the truth of a piece of wood or the strength of a stone. He died peacefully in his sleep one winter morning, with Lena's hand in his. He was 87 years old. The entire town, and people from settlements hundreds of miles away, came to honor him. They did not bury him in the town cemetery. Instead, they interred him on the hill he had known so intimately, next to Boro, within sight of the entrance to the refuge. The community commissioned a stonemason, the grandson of a man Elias had saved, to carve a marker. It was not a grand or ostentatious monument. It was a simple, thick slab of local granite, placed beside the great wooden door of the shelter, which now stood as a protected historical landmark. The inscription was short, echoing the man it honored. It read, Elias Thorn, 1921 to 2008. He dug deep and saved us all. The structure stands to this day. The winds still scour the high ridges, and the summers still grow hot and dry. But the town in the valley no longer lives in fear. They have learned the wisdom of the earth. They remember the quiet man who listened to the theories of his father, who endured the scorn of his neighbors, and who, with nothing but his own 2 hands and a stubborn belief in a better way, built a fortress not of stone, but of foresight. A legacy not of wealth, but of survival. And in the cool, silent darkness of the refuge, his memory and the quiet power of his persistence endures.